Today we are introducing the earth tones into our palette. In our last video, we determined that a limited palette will create a fairly realistic range of color for universal skin tones. In order to explore the subtlety of color within those mixtures and unify our overall color mixing within a piece, we need to use the earth tones. Together, they represent a simplified value scale for color, because yellow is the color of value. This is due to it having the softest color edge against white light. Remember, in illustration, we only need about 4 values to make something readable instead of a full 10 value scale for photorealism. Since highlights and shadows on the figure are both warm and cool, the earth tones help us see shifts between the two in a subtle way, without forcing color. Looking at this diagram, when white is added to the earth tones in the far right column, and black is added in the far left column, we see ways that each earth tone leans towards a certain color, as compared to the rest of the group. When viewed top to bottom as a value scale, we also see how closely related it is to a color wheel. So when we use the earth tones, raw umber will establish our darkest shadows, burnt umber will blend shadows either lighter or darker, burnt sienna will create a midtone, raw sienna will blend highlights either lighter or darker, and yellow ochre will establish our brightest highlights. Your use of all the earth tones can vary in your individual pieces, depending on mood, high key or low key, and overall aesthetic. A well-painted figure is uniquely different than a still life or landscape because it results in something that is not merely an artistic statement. Within the framework of a realistic figure painting, there is a limit on artistic license because realism has to look real to the natural eye, based on what we know from memory. And there are varying degrees based on style, but more than pose, or traits of the subject, or available time to finish the painting, the quality of light in your piece is most important because it determines color and form through shapes on the figure. This is why an artist's eye is more important than the tool they use to draw when it comes to interpreting what's in front of them. If we squint our eyes, we can see subtle shifts in color temperature on the face of the figure. These vary depending on the individual and may be more pronounced on others, depending on the weather, physical exertion, and the light source. Color temperature ranges also occur on the rest of the body, such as under normal conditions, fingers and toes may appear red or purple, and arms and legs may appear grayish-blue to purple. This relates to blood flow throughout the body. These examples of hands and feet are also meant to help you recognize that planar structure and gesture are necessary for their depiction as a painting or drawing. This is my palette setup. I lay my paint out on wet paper towel and set that inside a reusable enamel tray to mix. When I'm done, I cover the tray with saran wrap to save and prevent the paint from drying. For this demonstration, we will be using the earth tones, cadmium red light, black, and white to create a broad range of color for realistic universal skin tones. To begin a typical figure painting, I always do my gesture drawing in burnt sienna and then apply a light wash of burnt sienna again over the top, so that the white of the surface is knocked back and all other colors you add on top will be unified. You can use any earth tone for this and achieve different tones, but burnt sienna is the mid-tone and can be easily shifted lighter or darker, so that's why I like using it. You can also mix one dominant color to the initial earth tone wash if you know you want your piece to have an overall color key. Next, I block in all my darkest shadow shapes with raw umber. Next, I'll block in my brightest highlight shapes. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'll just use yellow ochre. Typically, I'd mix the actual color, but since we're learning what the earth tones do, I've simplified this. Next, I block in all my medium shadow shapes with burnt umber. These are areas where shadows are not quite as dark, but also not that bright. They also seem to have a slight warmth to them. At this point, I like to block in my background so that I see how my values and color on the figure are relating. I'm starting with white here and then adjusting accordingly. You can get opaque with the white in areas next to the edge of the figure that you want to draw more contrast to and round out the form. I'll get transparent with white in other areas that can just rest back. Next, I block in my medium highlight shapes with raw sienna. These are areas where highlights are not quite as bright, but also not that dark. Now I'll mix cadmium red light with white on my palette to match the brightest highlight values, and begin to tone the areas of yellow ochre on my painting. Your figure will now begin to show warmth and a sense of life. Next, I'll adjust my red-white mixture to create a second highlight value range, and begin to tone the areas of raw sienna on my painting. The temperature of a color depends on the light and the adjacent color. If I start every piece by looking for and blocking in the darkest darks and then the lightest lights, I've just found the most obvious elements and can then judge the more difficult and subtle areas in between. Remember, we want to find both warm and cool areas on the figure. So next, I'm going to introduce a cool into my shadows. I'm using black and white here to make it more pronounced, but you can mix raw umber or burnt umber with black for a more subtle, cool tone. Now, I'm going back and adjusting the size and edges of my shapes because our eyes will tell us how to interpret color and the overall figure based on their relationship with one another. I'm also adding a smoother, duller transition between my cool blue shadow and the midtone range. In addition to value, color, color temperature, and edges, a basic knowledge of anatomy is also important to tie everything together, because highlight and shadow shapes reflect planar shifts of the body's anatomy. In this next example, I'm beginning the piece in the exact same way with a drawing and wash in burnt sienna. I will then block in my darkest darks with raw umber. After that, when I block in my brightest brights though, I'll mix yellow ochre, cadmium red light, and white on my palette before applying to the painting. I'll continue to mix my colors on my palette for the rest of the piece, keeping in mind that I want to alternate between working on my darks, then lights, and eventually ending somewhere in the middle.